Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the program manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. The focus of today's webinar is specialty waste management and the life cycle of paint. Our presenter today is Sarah Battaglia, who I will introduce in a moment. Following her presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature box located on your control panel on your screen. You may also use the chat feature to request assistance if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and PA Recycling Market Center websites. Also note that Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center, its affiliates and funders, and the National Recycling Coalition assume no liability resulting from the use of any information provided during this webinar. The webinar is only provided as an informational tool and no discrimination is intended and no endorsement by these organizations is applied. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Sarah Battaglia is founder and CEO, is an experienced environmental consultant specializing in all facets of hazardous waste, including compliance, transportation, and disposal of municipal collection programs. In 2017, Sarah launched Olive Ridley Paints with a mission to provide businesses, organizations, and individuals with premium recycled content paint. Prior to establishing Olive Ridley, she worked several years in a business development capacity for Hasman, a household hazardous waste drop-off center in Tonawanda, New York. In this role, she planned waste management events through Western New York and worked with a wide range of customers to create customized recycling solutions. Sarah is a certified architectural coatings technologist by the Master Painters Institute. She's also certified in hazardous waste operations and emergency response. Her current professional and business affiliations include Launch New York, Canisius Women's Business Center, UB New York SERDA, Directed Energy Program, WNY Sustainable Business Roundtable, the Product Stewardship Institute, and the U.S. Green Building Council. Sarah holds an MBA from Canisius College and a BA in Communication Design from SUNY Buffalo. And I'm going to turn the program over to Sarah.
Thanks for the introduction, Wayne. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Battaglia, like you said. And the first question I usually get is why paint? So I just want to take a minute to tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in Youngstown, New York. It's about 25 miles north of Buffalo, New York. And living in Youngstown, I had the opportunity to grow up right on the border of Canada, right where the lower Niagara River flushes into Lake Ontario. So we're surrounded by fresh water. And as I've gotten older, I've really grown to appreciate that resource. I did go to University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, and then attended Canisius for my MBA. But while I was studying for my MBA, I was also working in the hazardous waste industry. And one of my main roles was to facilitate hazardous waste hauling services for manufacturers. But the company had also recently gotten a permit through the DEC to accept household hazardous waste for a fee. So that's the opportunity I had to get involved with a new business venture. And that's when I learned I liked business a lot and decided to go back to school for my MBA. One of the major things I learned in that experience is that paint waste is a common problem and it affects homeowners and municipalities across New York State, but then I learned across the country. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the paint problem in a little bit. So the goal of Olive Ridley is to bridge the gap between paint recyclers and the coatings market. But before I talk about Olive Ridley, I will do a quick presentation called The Specialty Waste and Life Cycle of Paint. This presentation is approved by the GCBI as well as the New York State Board of Architecture. And you can let us know if you need those credits and I can get you your certificate. So there's 4 main learning objectives for this technical component. One is waste identification. How is waste identified, categorized to certain regulations? 2, how can we plan to manage waste in a safe and economic way? 3, let's zero in on the paint waste that's out there and the economic and environmental impact of that material. And then 4, how can we utilize recycled content paint and where is it best fit? So first segment, waste identification. So I broke this section out into 2 different categories, pre-construction waste and post-construction waste. This is not terminology that we use in the waste world, but I thought that a lot of people encounter waste during construction projects, so it would make a lot of sense to break it up into that timeline. So prior to a construction project, the most common waste is C&D. You'll hear that word thrown around a lot in the industry, and C&D actually stands for construction and demolition debris. So that consists of drywall, structural elements, screws, insulation, etc. That material is typically consolidated to be landfilled. In some locations around the country, it can actually be considered zero landfill, where a recycler will take in those materials, sort them, and recycle them. And they'll have specific facilities to accept them. Another common material is asbestos. So a lot of times asbestos is determined at the phase 1 and confirmed at a phase 2 of a site assessment, which I'll talk about shortly. And asbestos, at least in New York State, is considered a hazardous waste. So that means it's required that it be remediated, for, excuse me, for disposal by a hazardous waste hauling company. Contaminated soil is something that's found on site from time to time as well. Usually that has to do with an industrial setting, such as a gas station or a manufacturing facility. Maybe there was a runoff in a previous time. And so that soil needs to be tested and then disposed of. And then the area where there was hazardous soil found, this could be oil contaminants, PCBs, it needs to be tested again, and then it's deemed clear. A lot of times contaminated soil goes hand in hand with underground storage tanks. So the underground storage tanks are usually a bulk storage form of oil or fuel. And so the tanks need to be pumped out and then removed of, and then the soil needs to be tested prior. And the last item I talked about here is legacy waste. Legacy waste is material that was left behind and we really don't have any paperwork on the material, and it needs to go through a series of analytical and research so that we can determine the best outlet for that waste. Post-construction material. So post-construction, and that the job is done, the occupants are in the space, and these are materials that are generated on a regular basis. In New York State, light bulbs, electronics, and batteries are considered universal waste, which means that when they're at a generator's when they're at a generator's business and they're being consolidated for transportation, they're not considered hazardous until they get to a facility. The reason being, all of these materials contain hazardous components to them, and once broken down to the recyclable components, they need to be regulated and treated differently. So for example, the light bulbs in the upper left-hand corner, those are considered fluorescent light tubes. Within the light tubes, they actually contain our mercury gas. So when the light bulbs are sent to the recyclers will smash the bulbs, capture the gases to be treated, recycle the metal components, and dispose of the glass. The electronics, on the other hand, those have a plethora of different parts, plastics, motherboards, wires, and those all need to be sorted for recycling. Batteries. So in the upper right-hand corner, those are considered alkaline batteries, which can be recycled, but there are other types of batteries that need to be sorted for recycling as well. There's NiCad, lithium ion. All of these batteries need to be sorted separately for recycling. And then finally, transformers. So transformers can be need to be tested for PCBs depending on the date. And as long as they don't contain PCBs, they can be drained out and sent for scrap metals for recycling. And then the last piece here is occupant generated. So different types of facilities or businesses will generate unique materials based on the operations at their facility. So for example, there was a facility in Buffalo, New York that would manufacture bullets, and one of their waste streams was in oil, but it came in contact with metals. So there was metal clippings in there, and so that needed to be treated as a hazardous waste. So I just wanted to show a couple photos of waste materials. Here we have a battery that's labeled very nicely. It says right on it, I am a lead acid battery. Do not throw me out. I can be recycled. Here is a photo, on the other hand, of legacy waste. The generator had no clue what was in this pile. So here it ended up being palletized agricultural products and then a drum of what we suspect was oil. However, because of the material being a mystery for some time and sampling needing to be done, this went from a maybe $400 disposal job to anywhere from $1,500 to $1,800 job. The material needed to be tested, and then the materials here needed to be overpacked. So everything that you see here with the blue tarp around it, that was moved into a triple yard cubic yard box with liner, and then the 55-gallon drum on the right needed to be overpacked in an 85-gallon drum for shipment and for transportation and disposal. So how can we plan and prevent legacy waste? Well, in New York State, we do work within regulatory requirements. So we have the New York State DEC that operates across the state to make sure that generators or businesses that are generating hazardous waste report these items and track them on a monthly basis. And at a federal level, the EPA defines what a generator is. So what hazardous waste is. So it's anything that is flammable, corrosive, explosive, or toxic. And if there is over 220 pounds of hazardous waste generated in a month at a New York State business, then they're considered a large quantity generator and they need to follow more stringent regulations. So the regulatory agencies look for waste characteristics, volume, and frequency to determine the generator status. And then it's the generator status that determines the regulatory requirements in terms of frequency of disposal, storage, maximum storage on site, and reporting frequency. Depending on the waste, they have different disposal options. So most of us are familiar with your typical paper, plastic, cardboard. There are facilities out there that are accepting that material and they sort it by hand, or maybe they keep it compiled and ship it right to a facility that will accept it as it is. Or there are facilities that have single stream recycling technology where they can actually take in all these materials and use automated processes to sort the material. The other thing that's always worth mentioning is that when you do have hazardous materials on site, it is important to know what resources you have available locally in case of an emergency. So it's important to know what risks are present and select a vendor or be familiar with a partner or service provider that could assist you in case of an emergency. The other thing that is notable to talk about, when would you as a professional encounter these types of regulations? Well, a lot of times during commercial real estate transactions, lenders often require buyers to go through a rigorous historical review of a site to make sure that you as the buyer have no surprise expenses. Because a lot of times if a site has a hazardous component to it, an investigation and cleanup is required. So most often lenders require a phase 1 where they do an historical review of the site. If there's any indication of hazardous materials on site, such as asbestos or contaminated soil or legacy waste, then a phase 2 will start, where a third-party engineer will come in and identify areas that need to be sampled and then run the samples. As long as the samples come back clean, this is just paperwork that supports the argument that the property is clean. But if it comes back as hot or red, then there will need to be a remediation that's done. And that's usually something that's negotiated between the buyer and the seller in terms of who's going to pay for the cleanup or remediation. So now let's talk about paint. Usually when I do this presentation in person, I have people raise their hands. So I say, has anyone here participated in a household hazardous waste event? Does anyone here have paint cans sitting in their basement or garages? So a lot of times what I found is that most people, usually about 75% of the room, their hands will be raised. And what the data shows is that most homeowners have 15 to 20 extra cans of paint sitting in their basement or garages. So what I found when I was working in the waste industry is that paint manufacturers sell their paint to retailers who then sell their paint to consumers who usually have that extra gallon. So most of it ends up on the walls, but some of it always ends up in storage. So what happens to that paint? Either it's collected at a household hazardous waste collection program, or it may be hidden in the trash and disposed of in a landfill. So what's been really interesting is that the American Coatings Association has decided to start a nonprofit called Paint Care, where they've created an extended responsibility solution for their waste. And in New York State, they've actually passed both the Senate and the Assembly for a bill this year. And we may see a paint stewardship program within New York State in 2021 because of this progress. So what that means is now that when homeowners buy a gallon of paint in New York State, they will be paying an extra, I think it's 50 cents to $1 per gallon, and that funding will go to Paint Care. And then Paint Care will distribute the funds to paint recyclers, or to haulers, who will then take the paint to paint recyclers. But the paint recyclers have this revenue on the front end coming in from collecting paint, and they really don't know how to sell it as a product. Some of them have found some really interesting, unique markets. But really one of the things that I'd like to see is regions that are recycling paint also using that paint on their walls. So back to the life cycle of paint. Like I said, on average, every home has 15 to 20 pounds of extra paint, 15 to 20 paint cans of extra paint, which is equal to about 60 pounds. And in New York State, leftover paint is one of the most expensive waste streams for the municipalities to manage. So just to give you an idea, regular trash in New York State costs anywhere from $60 to $70 a ton to dispose of, whereas paint waste can cost anywhere from $700 to $800 a ton to dispose of. And there's a few reasons why. So here's an example of a paint waste at an organization nearby. And as you can see here, there's some 5-gallon pails, there's some 1-gallon pails, and here there are a mixture of oil and latex paint. So when a contractor comes in to collect this material for disposal, they need to identify the latex from the oil, because the oil and the latex are both sent to different facilities. The oil-based paint can actually go to fuels blending facilities. So the 1-gallon cans are consolidated into cubic yard boxes, and the cubic yard boxes are sent to the facilities. And at the facilities, they actually take the boxes, open up each paint can, and scoop out the contents, where they blend the oil-based paint together, which they are able to create as a product, as a fuel, because it burns at such a high BTU. And then the cans get recycled. So there's actually a pretty old, quote unquote, old recycling process or solution for the oil-based paint. The latex paint, however, which is the growing waste stream for paint, is considered non-hazardous. So a lot of times household hazardous waste haulers will take that material to waste to energy facilities, or the recyclers are actually able to take in the paint, sort it by color, and blend it together. These different options vary depending on where you reside. So New York State's disposal market is going to be very different than Pennsylvania's disposal market, for example. And it's based on the haulers in the area and the facilities that are within a reasonable hauling distance. So how does paint recycling work? If there were a paint recycler in your region, what would that look like? So basically, homeowners bring their paint to household hazardous waste collection programs, drop-off centers, or retailers that choose to participate in the program. From there, the paint is shipped to the recyclers. The recyclers then take in the paint, they sort the oil from the latex, and then they sort the latex, the good from the bad. So a fun fact about paint in the Northeast has been manufactured to freeze twice. If it's frozen more than twice, then it can't be recycled. And this is something that you can do a visible test to see. The other tests, they look for contaminants, and as long as the visible tests are passed, then the latex paint is sorted by color. And then the colors are batched together, blended in large batches, tested, quality controlled, and then repackaged to be used on walls across the country. So in New York State, what is the economic impact of paint waste? So right now, New York State spends about $2.6 million on collecting paint, but that is just the tip of the iceberg. If Paint Care comes to New York State, then New York State will be able to collect this paint without adding any budget to collect it, and it will actually end up saving New York State $26 million every year. What is the environmental impact of recycled latex paint? So we had a life cycle assessment done, and we found that recycled content paint generates 4 times less greenhouse gases than virgin paint. It saves more energy per pound than other construction materials, such as steel, glass, and lumber. And if you look at the conservation of energy, utilizing a recycled gallon of paint versus new paint conserves 100 kilowatts hours of energy. So if you were to substitute 5,000 gallons of recycled content paint for virgin paint, that's equivalent to an energy savings of 50 homes per year. So where does recycled content paint fit in? Well, it really depends on where you live. So recycled content paint is usually most available in the states that are recycling paint. So here is a map of the Paint Care states, and New York State is likely the next one to be dark green on this map. So these states are also the ones recycling paint. The quality and the type of recycled paint really varies. So there's a handful of paint recyclers out there, about 10 to 12, and every recycler is different in terms of how much they've invested into the quality and consistency of the product, and also based on where they decide to send the product in terms of where there's a market. So for example, there's some recyclers out there that have 4 bases that are consistent batch to batch that they're able to sell to Habitat Restore. But then there's other recyclers out there that have found markets outside of the country. And then there's some recyclers in North America that are actually working on relationships at a retail level and servicing retail stores with pre-mixed paint. So the next question I usually get is, well, is this paint any good? So I did a lot of research on paint, and I took off my waste hat and I started working in the coatings industry, and I started researching products. And when I learned that in general, there's contractor grade paint and there's residential grade paint. And the contractor grade paint is applied by professionals, usually utilized at a very large volume, and so price is of the most concern, and it's usually a lesser quality paint. But residential grade paint, homeowners really don't want to paint their rooms more than once every 7 years, and so it's a very highly pigmented product, which means it's thick, it covers well, and it lasts a long time. And the really neat thing about recycled content paint is that our source for the product is residential grade paint. So contractors have been really happy with how it performs in terms of coverage and durability. Recycled content paint is also a great product for anyone that's looking to be sustainable. So it applies to both the LEED version 4 and the National Green Building Program credentials. The best application for recycled content paint is usually interior. The interior-exterior coatings are limited usually to 1 or 2 colors, whereas interior coatings we're able to come up with anywhere from 4 to 20 different consistent coatings. Typically, it's a low sheen, so it's right between flat and eggshell. So it's great for any commercial space, large quantities, or they're looking for pre-mixed direct ship application, or even, like I said, Habitat for Humanity if someone's looking for a low-cost alternative for their apartment building. It's also great for commercial projects when someone's interested in a cost savings. So with a higher quality paint, you're usually able to get away with one top coat instead of two. So here's an example of a project that's utilized recycled content paint. On the left is the before picture and the right is after. And in the back corner there, you can see the cocoa bean. Here's another photo of a before and after with cocoa bean and cashew of a paint recycler. And this concludes the continuing education course. Wayne, should I take questions now or should I jump into a little bit about the Olive Ridley product?
Yes, Sarah, you can go ahead and keep moving.
Okay, great. So now I can tell you a little bit more about Olive Ridley. Olive Ridley is one of the recycled paint brands that's available in North America. And the goal of Olive Ridley is to bridge the gap between paint recyclers and the coatings market. So why the name Olive Ridley? Well, Olive Ridley is a sea turtle species that's found all over the world. And one of the reasons that I keep pursuing this venture to sell recycled paint is because that I believe that we're all connected and we all need to conserve our resources. The other reason I loved the name Olive Ridley is that it kind of follows the crowd. So when I looked at naming a recycled content paint, I didn't want it to be eco paint or recycled paint. I wanted it to fit in with the coatings industry. So I looked at Sherwin-Williams and Benjamin Moore, and I saw that they have a personification component to their names. So I knew that I really wanted this product to have a name, and I wanted that name to be friendly yet sophisticated. So the Olive Ridley paint line offers post-consumer recycled content paint. Most of our products are 95% post-consumer recycled content. And we try to be mindful in the entire product itself. So we utilize FSC certified paper, and we also use 100% recycled plastic containers that are 100% recyclable as long as you have that facility nearby. That's the key. We have 3 different products. We have, most of our colors are 19 pre-mixed interior colors that have a velvet finish. We have 2 pre-mixed colors that are paint and primer and 1 as well. And then we have 1 primer, sealer, and undercoater. So like I said, it's 95% post-consumer recycled content. And it is available in 5-gallon pails. And here's a snapshot of the interior colors at the top here, the 2 interior, exterior, and the primer at the bottom. And like I said, our source is residential grade paint. So that puts our paint at a relatively high quality, especially when you look at commercial projects. Every single batch is rigorously tested for quality control. So we test for bacteria, pH, density, grind, foaming, floating. All of these things are tested in our 1,200-gallon batches. And the color does vary batch to batch, but nothing that we can see with the naked eye. The paint has really great hiding power. It's durable and washable. And all of our colors, except for the primer, are paint and primer in 1. It covers really well. So some coatings products are between 300 and 350 square feet per gallon. Olive Ridley's coverage rate is 430 square feet per gallon. And like I said before, it does apply to green building projects.
It's 2 o'clock.
So we have a credit for the building design and construction, as well as the operations and maintenance credit. And then for the green building standard, recycled content credit for the National Green Building Program. And like I said, we're thoughtful in the materials that we use to package our product. So when we compare Olive Ridley to Virgin Paint or Virgin's Eco Paint, Virgin Paint is able to say that they have no VOCs sometimes, but the Olive Ridley line is low VOC because of the nature of the beast. So we accept paint that was low VOC to begin with. The paints were off-gassed when they were utilized in the home. They were off-gassed again when they were visually tested at our facility, and then off-gassed again during the batching process. Virgin paint will always have the ability to do every color under the sun. Recycled content paint, not so much, because our goal is really to utilize the most post-consumer recycled content we can. And utilizing recycled content paint utilizes 4 times less greenhouse gases than virgin paint. We are UL Logo Eco certified, and our paint consists of 95% post-consumer recycled content material. Olive Ridley is owned by a New York State WBE certification, so there's an incentive for government agencies to consider working with us. And we utilize thoughtful products in our packaging. And one of the things we're working on is a relationship with the Turtle Foundation out of Switzerland to donate a percentage of proceeds to adopted turtle programs. There's a couple testimonials here from painting contractors and developers that I've worked with in the area. One of the things we've done to make our designers and architects' job easier is we've created a custom toolbox for them to access all of our design tools online at their fingertips. Here's some photos of a recent project. So this was this paint was put on the walls about 4 weeks ago. And as you can see here, they utilized Atlantic in the upper left-hand corner as an accent wall for the bathrooms. And majority of the space was Dolphin all the way on the right. It was used in the hallways and the offices. We have some upcoming projects where they're utilizing recycled content paint locally as well as in the New York City area. So why do people choose Olive Ridley? Why do they want to work with us? Well, one is we're consistent and convenient. All of our paint is manufactured in a factory controlled setting, and we know that the batches will be the same every time. With our high coverage, we're finding that GCs are happy that they can save time and money during the application process of the paint. If they're applying to a LEED building certification, then they're able to leverage our post-consumer recycled content as a high percentage, being 95%, when they calculate the sustainable value criteria. And if they are seeking funding from New York State, or this is a project that's owned by a state or federal agency, it will help them be in compliance with federal or state purchasing requirements, both on the woman-owned business side and on the recycled content side. And together, we're all solving the paint problem. So we're setting a precedent, not only for paint, but hopefully other recycled content materials. So what we hope is that you, your colleagues, and the businesses that you work with think of Olive Ridley paints for your projects. It's really a simple switch. It doesn't require redesigning an HVAC system. It's simply a product substitution. So our ask is to consider, offer, specify. And when we do work with architects and designers, we provide them with different tools to make their life really easy when they choose to specify Olive Ridley paints. Thank you. That's the conclusion of the presentation.
Okay, great presentation, Sarah.
Thank
So
you.
we're now going to field some questions for Sarah. Again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature on your control panel. So while we're waiting for some questions to come up, I have a couple. So Sarah, you might have addressed this earlier, but what's your service area as far as collection of material, and then what's your market area, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. So we have partners on the collection side that I refer businesses to, but our long-term goal is to be doing the recycling ourselves. So right now, like I said, in New York State, it's not economically feasible to recycle paint until the bill passes. So currently, I'm able to refer homeowners and businesses to hazardous waste companies that will then come by, pick up the material, and ship it out for recycling.
You mentioned the the cost to the state, is that their program costs through the state? Is that through like a grant program or
Mhm.
their own collection programs?
Yep. So in New York State, household hazardous waste programs are given a 50% reimbursement grant through the DEC as long as it meets certain eligibility. And the way that it's written right now is that it covers 100% of hazardous waste, which means it excludes latex paint. So it's also skewing the actual costs associated with latex paint collection and disposal because of that, the way the grant's written.
So I know some programs, on HHW collections, they won't collect the latex paint, obviously because it's not toxic, and they give them alternatives, like you can pour it into a box of cat litter or something like that. So what are your feelings on that practice of diverting that away from the collection?
Mhm. So it's not unsafe, so that's a good thing. But in terms of um, drying it out, that's not ideal for a couple of reasons. One, if it's dried out, well, it's very, first of all, if you do opt to go that way, it isn't very important that it's dried out, because if it's not dried out and ends up in the back of a garbage truck, then you may end up seeing your paint for the next 10 years down the middle of your street. So if you do opt to go that route, it is really important to dry it out. The problem with that is the cans a lot of times are very heavy, so it is wasted weight on the truck as well as airspace in the landfill. So they may be heavy yet empty. So the cans aren't compacted and they're also not recycled. So we're missing out on the opportunity to reclaim both the packaging and the contents of the otherwise good material.
Like some home furnishing stores, they do take back paint. Does that go back to the manufacturer, or do they dispose of that through a local program somewhere?
That's a good question. I don't know. I've never seen that here.
Yeah.
What types of coatings is it? Are they like
Latex paint.
epoxies?
Yeah.
They're taking back latex paint?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what they're doing with that
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
It's possible they're recycling it themselves because it is non-haz. So maybe they're able to recycle it themselves and
Right.
reblend it.
Right. So anybody have any more questions? If not, we're gonna wrap it up. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded. Oh, here's one. Hold on. Oh, this is a comment on the nice color palette. What's the typical lead time on a order, and how far do you typically ship?
Oh, good question. Thank you for the color palette compliment. It's actually driven by everyone's paint selection across the country. So I guess everyone here has good taste. Our price point is $38.99, but when we per gallon. But when we sell for large projects, we usually end up giving a 10 to 20% discount depending on the size of the project. Lead time. So for local projects, I usually need about 3 business days to shake and deliver the paint. If it's anything outside of upstate New York, I usually would need between 5 to 7 business days if it's under 150 gallons. If it's over that, then 4 weeks probably would be a safe bet.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Oh, here we go. Do you have any insights on how we might garner legislative support to move this forward in Pennsylvania?
Yes, so I could basically, there's been a gentleman, a group of people in New York State that have been rallying for this for about 6 years. So it takes a lot of time, but maybe that's something you would know, Wayne, actually. If there's a recycling coalition like yourself that could help to identify stakeholders and put together a campaign. Paint Care and the Product Stewardship Institute would be resources that you could tap into to provide you with the data and the letters of support that you need as well.
Okay. Okay, any other questions?
The other thing I'll add, if anyone's interested in following Olive Ridley, we do have an Instagram page, oliveridleypaints.com. So you can search for us on there. And I post updates there about where we'll be, what products we're announcing, our popular colors, recent projects, etc. So feel free to follow us on there. And you can ask questions right on Instagram too, if something comes up in the future.
Okay, so, okay, now we're going to wrap it up. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar, and please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And thank you again, Sarah, for putting on this great presentation.
Thank you, Wayne.
Okay, have a great day, everybody.